So I'm here with Olav Sorenson, and he is the Joseph Jacobs Chair in Entrepreneurial Studies. He's professor of strategy at UCLA at the Anderson School. And we're just going to talk a bit about PhD life. And welcome, Olav, to the conversation.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I'm looking forward to it.
All right, this is very cool. So I guess where I'd like to start is, how did you ever get interested in pursuing research as a career? It seems kind of a strange thing that not too many people do.
Yeah. So both my parents are academics, although they taught at, liberal arts colleges. Although because both of them were academics, I sort of swore that one thing I was not going to do was academia. But then, so when I was a, senior in college, my plan was to go into management consulting, which was, the tried and true path for so many undergrads. So I went and was doing interviews with, McKinsey and BCG and all the, kind of usual subjects. But that was 1990. And, sort of there was a little bit of a recession in the fall of that year. I remember, I think it was Bain laid off like a third of their whole workforce. And so all of the consulting companies basically just shut down undergraduate recruiting, because why not just hire somebody who's actually experienced instead of, a new undergrad? So then I was like, well, what am I going to do? And thought that a good way to sort of wait out the recession was to go to grad school. So I applied to some grad schools. And then even in grad school, I still wasn't sure that I was going to do academia. Actually, I'd done consulting the whole time that I was, sort of on my own. I'd done some consulting with a company, and they had offered me a position. They wanted me to start a subsidiary. So they'd offered me basically a position to be the kind of president and founder of the subsidiary, data analytics. I was thinking like I would probably do that, but my advisor and dissertation committee encouraged me to apply to jobs, and I got a couple of offers. So then I decided, well, I'll try out academia for a few years.
So that was, did you not do a master's degree then? You went straight into a...
Basically, I had a little bit of circuitous grad school. So I first started at UNC Chapel Hill in sociology.
Wait a minute, sociologists, they actually know something.
Yeah. So, but I wanted to do, I was interested in studying organizations, but the people that were doing organizations there weren't really doing kind of a version that I would found that interesting. So, actually I quit grad school, and then, took a year off and reapplied to other graduate schools. And so that's when I ended up, going to Stanford sociology as well.
And that was, you found your home a little bit more, essentially, is what you were saying.
Yeah, Stanford was great. I mean, at the time it was like, just had an incredible organizations faculty, right? Because, Mike Hannon was there, who I ended up working with. I was really interested in kind of more quantitative approaches, especially to the kind of theory side. But you have Jen March, who is also, one of my co-chairs, and Bill Barnett, Joel Podolny, Dick Scott, who else was there?
So maybe because this is, there is a lot of people from around the world that are probably perhaps interested in research. Maybe you can give, a little bit of synopsis of what these people are interested in.
So each of these,
Yeah.
so it was a pretty interesting organizations group because, they all had they had somewhat different perspectives, right? So, Dick Scott was very much in the sort of the institutional kind of school, thinking about organization, oftentimes non-commercial organizations, things like nonprofits, governments, but the running as organizations and how that influenced the environment for other organizations. So the rules that they had to play by and the norms for operating. Mike Hannon, sort of founder of organizational ecology, kind of applying the ideas of biological research on ecological systems to organizations, thinking about competition and more recently legitimation, access to resources. Joel Podolny did work on status at the organizational level. Bill Barnett also did work on organizational ecology. Jim March is probably best known for his work on organizational decision making. But lots of different interesting work over the years. He started out as a political scientist, and one of his early papers was thinking about the organization as a political institution where you've got different coalitions that are negotiating with each other for kind of what direction the firm's going to take. After his own experience in running an organization, because he was the founding dean of social sciences at UC Irvine. That led to some pretty interesting research, including the garbage can model, which models organizational decision making as a garbage can where you're throwing in problems and solutions and kind of almost randomly picking them out and attaching them to each other. So there were lots of interesting ideas that were all around organizations, but very different perspectives on how organizations operate.
So there's two interesting things I'm thinking about. Maybe I'll start with the first one that might be of interest to the people that are following along. You had mentioned that you could have been the founder of a company or a startup company and perhaps made a phenomenal salary, or went off and become a titan of the world. Instead, you went into graduate school and kind of did this wandering process of, is this for me? And how did you arrive upon going from that very concrete world of that you're pursuing success and money and all of that kind of stuff to this more eclectic profession that we're supposed to be?
I mean, I think even when I was doing consulting and sort of the kind of data analytics, they didn't call it data analytics then, but what now we would call data analytics work. I mean, what I always liked about that is it's like problem solving, right? And what I like about academia is basically we're kind of almost like professional problem solvers. And there's always new problems. You're always kind of learning new things and kind of thinking through approaches. So, I've long said that, research is consumption, right? I mean, it's most of us would get paid more if we did something different. But part of what makes this job enjoyable and satisfying is, doing something that is sort of intrinsically rewarding. And for me, sort of doing the research and problem solving is intrinsically rewarding.
Yeah, the challenge aspect or the uphill battle all the time, the sort of mountain climbing aspect of this is fairly rewarding. As much as it is to climb mountains or to climb Mount Everest, and when you pass by somebody that's actually frozen into the mountain, I'm assuming it's probably a very, very similar experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so one of, kind of Jim March's sayings and, kind of principles was that, if you wanted to sort of be satisfied, the pleasure needed to be in the process. And I think that's right? Like you need to enjoy what you're actually doing, right? So if the satisfaction that you're getting is just reaching the top of the mountain, like that's going to be really hard, right? Because those types of rewards in academia are, relatively far and it's few and far between. But if you actually enjoy, the process of doing the research, the process of, I actually really enjoy writing, right? Process of writing. Then, that's happening on a daily basis. So, I think that's a large share of what can make this profession, enjoyable.
So yeah, and so for me, the writing is tough. It always has been tough. But the problem solving or the challenge or like, hey, that's a curious thing is always there. The other thing that I wanted to talk about that was really interesting that I think a lot of people don't see, at least it's not talked about in popular culture, is that a lot of these folks that have been very, very influential have very eclectic backgrounds, right? Like they, maybe they're in political science or sociology, and these are fields that I would say don't get a lot of play. I think political science gets some play in popular culture, but sociology would not. What do you have to say about these particular fields that are somewhat that are maybe not getting the credit that they deserve? And why is it important to study this in terms of understanding the business or even government world that we see around us today?
Yeah. I think sociology at times has gotten more attention, and political science for sure has definitely gotten more attention. I guess you're sort of thinking relative to economics, which has certainly been more successful. I think part of it is let's say, to take a very kind of institutional theory answer, part of it is, like the very mathematization, I think, of economics gives it, some legitimacy, right? So it feels more like a hard science than a lot of political science, although there is, an area of political science that's all game theory, right? So that's very quantified. But a large share of political science is also more like comparative historical. We're sort of doing kind of more case-based and qualitative research. Sociology empirically, I think, has gotten more sophisticated, but theoretically tends to be pretty much kind of verbal theory. So I think that's kind of one aspect of it. But I think the other aspect of it is like problem picking, right? I think that sociology used to do a really good job, I think, of picking big, important societal problems. But I think that it's made the mistake of almost like ceding territory to economics, right? So like as economists have become more interested in things other than, what had been, kind of the neoclassical, very constraining model, and have started, really expanding into all kinds of different things, sociologists have almost like retracted from those areas. So, there's just lots of areas where you don't see much anymore. There's very little organizational sociology anymore in sociology departments. It's all in business schools. There's very little economic sociology anymore. Demography feels like it's shrinking. Even sociology of education is has kind of become smaller. Fewer and fewer people are doing stuff on social networks. What we've seen massive expansion on is, kind of identity issues. And obviously in the current environment, that's not very helpful for sociology. They actually are getting attention, just not good attention.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's what I was thinking. And you're probably a really good person to study or to talk about this because you're let's say more on the sociology side, learning and studying things like startups or venture capital and various different things like that. How has that been important to inform these particular phenomenon, and how is that different? I think a lot of people would look at this and say, well, these are areas for the hard science to study, or these are for engineers. They're the ones that understand startups, and only engineers should be doing startups. What has been your perspective in understanding how all of this evolves over time? What is the sort of social structure behind
Sure.
the creation of new products and
right. So most of my most of my research has really been thinking about what I would call the resource mobilization process. So there's coming up with the idea itself, right? I've done a little bit of research in that area, but not a lot. But then there's once you have the idea, you need to put together a team, you need to get funding, attract customers. That I would think of those as all being different types of resources that the entrepreneur needs to put together. And it's a really difficult problem for the entrepreneur. It would be one thing if you're independently wealthy, right, and you can just go out and buy all these things, then it's not so hard. But the problem is the typical entrepreneur doesn't really have much in the way of resources. And so, it's a combination of, sort of persuasion and, kind of trust and, oftentimes social exchange that people are using in order to get employees, to get funding. And that's very much, a social process rather than, obviously it's economic in the sense that there's exchange, but what's being exchanged for those resources are not other resources, right? And so I've typically looked at this as being a function of social networks. But I think there's other ways of looking at the problem that are also, kind of social, psychological, social, sociological that are interesting. For example, it's not my research, but I think this work that Michael Lounsbury and Marianne Glenn have done on the importance of kind of narratives and storytelling for entrepreneurs is really interesting, right? It's you need to, part of convincing people to join you, right, in your venture is having a compelling narrative.
Finding the right story.
Right.
Yeah. And you may only get that through hard knocks.
Yeah, well, oftentimes you have to experiment, right, and see which stories resonate with people.
Yeah. That's exactly it. But that's the positive way to say it. But another positive way is that you just have a lot of no's along the way. Yeah. So. I love your research, by the way. I think it's super fascinating stuff often. And why, what are the key things that you've seen, given that, things like maybe social status or something like that actually matters? What are the things that somebody could do practically that, maybe is from a different context, a different country or something like that they can actually do to convince, maybe it's somebody else to to invest in them? And this is true whether it's in building a new product as well as convincing a graduate school to actually invest in you as a person.
Yeah, I think one of the mistakes that a lot of times gets made is people are, when they're approaching, say, asking for funding, they're maybe trying to do that in a first meeting, right? And I think that, that rarely works out, right? It's one thing if you're talking about a professional investor like a venture capitalist, but even then, what you see, that seems to be far more successful is, if the relationship has been built for a while, right, before there's any sort of resource ask, then you're much more likely to, to actually get a positive response, right? And I think so. It's I think there's an interesting philosophical question about like whether you can, if in some sense, like fake it, right? I mean, like my sort of view is like if you are being too instrumental in kind of who you're building relationships with, they probably aren't that authentic, and they may not actually lead to any, kind of getting any resources, getting any help or funding. If you're, sort of genuinely building relationships with people that, you sort of like, enjoy spending time with, and then at some point, you make asks, those are the ones that I think are much more likely to pay off. I guess the question is like, can somebody fake that, right? Or does it have to be, sort of genuine interest in the other person, creating that relationship in order for it to be successful? I don't think we really know. I think the research that's been done, it's basically we observe, types of relationships that people have, and then we look at, kind of whether that's related to, hiring, getting funding, et cetera. But we don't really observe or have much information about where those relationships came from, how long they existed before the ask, those types of things. And I think, kind of really understanding what's happening in some sense probably requires more detailed research there.
Yeah, that's super fascinating. I would agree. I mean, there's a couple of things that I was thinking about with this. The first one is how do you actually, from a researcher perspective, how do you measure that authenticity? That's like that's really squishy. Right?
Yeah.
It's much easier to measure network structure,
right,
and who knows who. But how do you get at that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard. And the part of the reason it's really hard is it's like we're trying to, like if we sort of think about fundamentally what we would like to know, it's like we'd like to know the person's intentions, right? When they're forming the relationship. But, even if we ask, right, like would we believe them, sort of what they claim to be their intentions? It's like a fundamentally unobservable thing. It's, it's in the person's mind. They may know, but they have no incentive to tell us the truth. And so, so how can we make use of that? I mean, I could imagine there might be some kind of clever ways of doing something that's almost like an instrumental variable where you're, kind of finding something that, might be a reason why there would be sort of a, sort of a more intrinsic motivation for forming the relationship. Or, the other type of approach that we've seen is where what we're measuring, instead of actually measuring the relationships, we measure the exposure, right? So we measure whether or not somebody had like the opportunity, they met somebody that could have formed a relationship, and we basically make use of the exposure information, in kind of trying to do our empirical analysis instead of the formation of the relationship, which becomes endogenous to a lot of things.
That's what I was thinking about. I think it's a study by Bruce Kogut from a few years ago about the RFID. They had like it was like a meeting or something like that, and people were wearing RFIDs and were just looking to see how well they actually mix together. I think the title was "People Actually Mix at Mixers," which I think is a very clever title. And they found out that they didn't. Right, like we just kind of naturally cluster together with our own networks and own friends and things like that, which leads some credence, I guess, to the idea that things take time to build legitimacy.
Right. No, I mean, absolutely. I think the sorry, I'm thinking of whose book in Blau. So Peter Blau, a long time ago, like in his 1964 book, actually writes about the kind of thinking a little bit about the relationship formation process and the idea that part of what happens is that you need to have these, like, people gradually move from very inconsequential exchanges, maybe sort of get trading some information that's not that sensitive or something, almost as like a way of kind of building but also testing whether or not the other partner is trustworthy, right? And so kind of you gradually like up the ante, right? And this can take years to months or years to build a trusted relationship. There's a I can't remember who did the paper now, but there was an interesting study that I read many years ago, which talked about, like, how long does it take to develop a close friendship? And the punchline was that it's something like on the order of 400 hours of dyadic exchange, right? Where it's like really just kind of the two people interacting. And I mean, it's interesting then when you sort of think about things like, most people don't have many close friendships that they've made with people after college, right? And I think one of the reasons why, if you think about like, well, when do you have enough time to spend, hours and hours and hours in these kind of dyadic exchanges? Like, once you have a job, and certainly like once you have a kid and family, kids and family, like you don't have any time, right? So, it's like your network becomes frozen, right? At least those kind of trusted close ties, maybe until, retirement, right? When maybe people then have more time again.
That's fascinating, because it's almost a symptom of how we design work today, right?
For sure. Yeah.
In terms of these sort of quick little meetings and things like that, that it lends itself to much more of a superficial way of actually doing work together.
I think that's right. And I think remote work, is even worse than that, right? I mean, because then you typically are only sort of connecting with people when there's like a question or a topic that you want to discuss. It's like directed.
When it's very strategic, right?
Yeah.
That you're trying to get something out of it. Directed. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, changing topics. This is, by the way, I think this is very, very fascinating. You had mentioned that, you're sort of managing family life or all of that. How are you able to do that being, from what I understand, you're fairly successful as a researcher, as a scholar. How are you able to balance all of these worlds that go on in your life?
I mean, it's hard. I mean, I think, I've got 3 kids, so and they're now 13 and 11 and 11. So basically, once we get to 3:30, 4 p.m., the rest of the day is kids' activities, and the weekend is basically kids' activities. So, I mean, I think that, the 2 things that I try to do is, one, I get up early. So, I'm usually up by 5, which gives me a little bit of a window before the kids get up, where I can get stuff done. And then I try to be pretty careful about blocking some time. So, I try to cluster my meetings and things in, 2 or 3 days a week, so that then I have some fairly unbroken time that I can devote to, kind of writing, research. I think the other thing that I mean, I've never been somebody who I think was easily distracted, in the sense that, like, I never was like much of a web browser or, like on social media or anything. But I think I've become even more focused during the time that I'm working, right? So I don't have a lot of time, so I really am, kind of trying to get stuff done. I do think that felt like this was true in graduate school, even. Like, there's a dangerous trap where people think that like more is always better. And there were people, like, I had fellow grad students who would spend, they'd show up in the office 8, 9 in the morning, and they'd be there until 9 at night. But they weren't that productive, right? Because what would happen is they get a little bit of work done, then they get, kind of tired, then they'd start, having, they'd spend a lot of time socializing, or, not really browsing the web then, because it was the, early 90s, but, doing something, and not really being that productive with their time. I think there's something to be said for which is hard, I think, in academia, to separate the sort of the work time and the non-work time, and to, not let the, kind of the work just bleed into everything.
Yeah, I also think too is that you have to actively work at not feeling guilty about not working, right? Like, I think that the incentives are there to lie. There's very clear incentives always in the academic game of what it actually means. And, converting requires you to actually achieve that, requires a certain amount of writing. And that incentive is so clear to you. It's kind of like, the Jim March idea of exploration, exploitation, right? So exploitation, you have immediate rewards, very clear, and you're going to work towards that. But then there's this idea of exploration, which is much more broader, and doing things that are often irrelevant at the time that may lead to something that's a little bit bigger. And I often think about this trade-off alone, but it's not only about that there's this trade-off, but it's like managing that guilt that, hey, it's really good often to go spend time with family and friends, and, doing those kind of things as well.
Yeah. No, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think the thing that is hard to fit in, kind of speaking of this kind of exploration, exploitation, I used to spend a fair amount of time just reading things that were totally unrelated to, research that I'm doing, just stuff that, like, I had no idea that it might be interesting, but, just learning about different subjects, sometimes not even social science. And that, I feel like I've had a hard time kind of maintaining, right? So now most of that reading is confined to my vacation. Like, so when we do our summer vacation, I usually bring 4 or 5 physical books, try to unplug from email and internet, and just read physical books, but it's not the same level as it used to be.
Yeah, I kind of feel the same way too, in terms of that. The sort of exploratory stuff is very challenging to keep up with, and there's always something new. There's always more interesting things that are present. But you were able to balance that over the lifetime of the body of work that you've created is actually quite substantial. So you must have figured something out with this.
Yeah.
So tell me a bit about this new application or software that you're part of as an academic advisor.
Sure. Yeah. So I joined about 1.5 years ago. Joined this company called Breakout Learning as the chair of their academic advisory board. So what Breakout Learning does is they have a platform that facilitates small group discussions. So it's basically like, imagine that you have, sort of 3 to 6 students who are essentially in like a Zoom call, and the platform usually gives them some prompts on kind of questions that you'd like them to discuss. It might be related to a case. It could be related to another reading material or even a news event or something. Then, they discuss it, and then the AI is sort of sitting in the background, recording, transcribing that. And then I think what's really interesting for the instructor is that it's categorizing what they're talking about, and also making some assessments about how sophisticated their discussion is on those topics. So is it just kind of factual? Are they doing analysis? Are they actually, kind of applying topics across settings? And then the instructor sort of can go in and see all of that in a dashboard, and click in even on like what individual students are talking about. But it's really, I think it's interesting in two respects. One is AI has made it very difficult to do case discussions in the classroom because students are just not reading the cases. They're just using AI to summarize it. But this has this, like, it's not about the AI. What's interesting about this is that it's almost like the social technology, right? The fact that they have to have this small group discussion with their peers. I think, they don't want to show up and have all their peers realize they didn't do anything. So they actually do then prepare. And when they come to class, they're actually very well prepared to discuss. The other thing is that having a sense of what they said in the, in these small group discussions actually gives you a good sense of like where you want to spend your time in the in-class discussion, right? Because some topics kind of everybody's getting, and it turns out if you spend a lot of time on that in class, it's not going to be that interesting because everybody sort of already gets it. But then there's other things you can see that people are kind of struggling with, and so you can, allocate more time in class to that. That's oftentimes really hard to do if you're doing just a big group discussion, relying on people to raise their hands when when they have questions. But I think a lot of times they don't because they're sort of embarrassed to admit it. They think that they're the only ones.
Mm-hmm. A lot of this, it's ironic. I talk about this a lot, right? On I don't know if you've watched any of the videos I put out, but a lot of it is you often think that you're the only one, that you don't understand something. And you realize it's actually a lot of people that feel the same way, and you have to sort of coach these insights out, or coax them out.
Yeah, absolutely. And then with the platform, you can, even if you want to, kind of do some quantification of this. You can be like, well, 75% of the students felt like they didn't really understand this, so let's spend time on it, right? Because you actually have enough detail about what they talked about and their level of understanding to make those kind of statements.
So what I'm interested in right now, because this, people can go look at the platform. It's called Breakout Learning, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and I'll put a link in the description. But what I'm interested in, two things, since we have a limited amount of time, is first of all, what have you learned in terms of being part of this, the either innovator or entrepreneurship process, depending on how you want to look at it, as an academic, and whether it actually was valuable to do this. I'm not sure if you want to publicly talk about that. And then, towards the end of this, what I want to do is talk more about the implications of AI and changing technology,
sure,
as researchers and as educators.
Yeah.
So that's where I would like to start here.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll start. So first, there's kind of what I'm learning about the classroom. I think it's been, it's been interesting to sort of think about how, kind of using these small group discussions can just improve the quality of large discussions. I actually, and we can kind of come back to that, talking about AI more generally. But I think in some ways, some of the most interesting things have been seeing, kind of upfront how this company has been developing and evolving. One of the things that's very different about it from a lot of startups that I study, that I've, kind of been involved with before, is that the founder of this, Ramit Varma, is a very successful entrepreneur. So he already had one venture called Revolution Prep, very successful exit to private equity, and he's basically more or less self-funding breakout learning. And I think that, because there's two things. So one is, there's a fair amount of financial resources there. So, most entrepreneurs are having to make these like trade-offs, like basically like, where do I want to put resources? There's not that kind of hard constraint here, right? I mean, obviously you don't want to do things inefficiently, but if it's something that's worth spending money on, you can just, they can just spend money on it. And I think the other thing is that, because he's grown and run a large organization, he has an appreciation for what types of things you would want to put in place early so that as it starts to scale, it sort of doesn't trip up in that process. Right? I think like academically, I feel like we've spent a lot of time focusing on the very early stage, right? Like the founding team, like getting that first investment, finding product market fit, and surprisingly little on, how you get from, let's say, 100,000 a year in sales to 10 million in sales. And yet, if you talk, I've talked with a lot of entrepreneurs about this. I think like your average entrepreneur would say, it's easier to start than to make that 100,000 to 10 million transition. That's what's oftentimes really hard. So like simple things like, he realized at one point that, there was some problems with, basically with just like the UI, right? It had nothing to do with the actual sort of features, but, people have to log in and kind of get set up and so, like within a week he had hired a full-time, quality control engineer. He had actually had the entire basic organization essentially shift over for a short period of time to kind of stress testing and figuring out, well, where would this go wrong? Because he thought it was, that important to making sure that, it doesn't sort of trip up future growth to get this right, kind of now. And I think a lot of organizations that weren't as well resourced or that didn't have as experienced a founder probably would have, sort of let that fester in a sense, right? Like, well, we'll work on it, but it's like just another one of the kind of set of problems we're going to work on while we're doing other stuff.
Yeah, I think Hazir Ramadan in Nelson Phillips? No.
Phillips, yeah.
Yeah, they have a paper on this, essentially, like firefighting problem that you start developing over time as you let these little problems propagate up. But it's unless you have that experience, right? You don't know what is actually important because there's always problems.
There's always things, right? There's always fires.
It's always ugly too. Like you want it to be better, but you can't quite do it because you just don't have those resources. So having the resources is actually quite nice. Not only financial resources, but the wherewithal.
The wherewithal. Also, I mean, some of the kind of key people are people that he basically pulled over from his old business, right? So also in the resources in the sense that, having these people that, he has a good relationship with, he trusts, he understands, kind of how they work, and being able to, kind of access that kind of talent right away is another, kind of type of resource as well.
Yeah, that tends to be a very difficult thing of trying to convince people that are talented to belong to something that is, you're just making up on the fly, right? Like, that's often very, very challenging. The question that I was thinking about as you were talking about that he was well funded is, how does this change the relationship in terms of the decisions that he makes, and particularly those, in Silicon Valley, you're more in that kind of culture where they have to get venture capital and all of that kind of stuff. And venture capital tends to put very tight restrictions, or they can, right?
Yeah.
how does that funding structure change the questions and approaches that you pursue?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think one of the big differences is, so he's not taken any venture capital, and I think it would look very different if it were VC funded. So, because it's like bootstrapped basically, right? Even though it's fairly well funded, the focus is still to some extent on like, what do we do to get to be cash flow positive as soon as possible, right? So like, how do we make this a sustainable business economically? And I think part of the problem for with VCs for a lot of founders, and why I actually think oftentimes VCs are almost like blowing up companies, because they're so focused on getting that that big exit, right? That they'll encourage companies to do things that not only are not moving to a sustainable model, but are maybe even making the business less sustainable, kind of in the interests of possibly getting that home run, right? Mm-hmm. So, we're gonna, like in this case, you could imagine, well, instead of kind of figuring out what the right price point is, and kind of figuring out the relation, kind of the right relationship to the cost of providing the service versus the price that they're going to charge. I think if it were VC, they would say, look, just get, market share, right? Mm-hmm. Like, go out, basically price it at a level that's probably not, that's losing money on every, incremental unit, but push out and get as much market share as fast as possible. Hmm. And there's a world in which that, that could work, right? I mean, that could be the way that you get to be a unicorn, right? And get sold, but also it puts it in the company a very precarious position, because it's now reliant on getting these VC injections of capital, rather than being able to sort of live off of sales. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, the other thing too is that the definition of success tends to be very different, though, too, right? It's that exit, and it could be making a sale to, I don't know, Google or whatnot.
Right.
Is a great exit, but then Google doesn't care about it, and they're gonna,
Yeah, that's right. You could go for a partner that's not going to care and just going to let it die. I mean, the other thing is like the size of the exit, right? So, like if the founder ends up having only, kind of 25% or, less maybe ownership in the company, then, even like $1 billion exit may not leave the founders sort of that well off, right? But if you own 100%, or the founders plus the employees own 100%, even a smaller exit starts being pretty attractive.
It changes things a lot.
Right.
Yeah, it's fascinating, because I think that that's a different story than what is often told in like MBA cases and things like that. Yeah. Even I was talking to somebody at the Harvard Business School a few months ago, and they're encouraging people to even do like these small, mom and pop shops that would have been disqualified as legitimate businesses. But if you start looking at some of the economics of this, if you open up a garage, for example, like a mechanic shop, that would be actually quite profitable, particularly if you own everything.
That's right. No, that's right. And especially if that might become a chain, right? Where you have more than one location. Exactly. Like some of these are, can be quite profitable businesses. I agree. I think MBAs are coming around to that more, in the sense that we're seeing more interest in, entrepreneurship through acquisition, which is oftentimes focused on more of these types of businesses that are, less tech, but maybe very, profitable businesses to own and run.
Yeah. So my wife's a veterinarian, and they just went through, it's still going through this consolidation that's happening across much of America. It used to be like little small shops, and they're being bought up by these larger conglomerates because it's profitable.
Yeah.
to do so. And a lot of these folks actually don't want to run the business part of it. It often tends to be a little bit tedious. So given that, why did you choose to go into an education startup like this, particularly, with the onslaught of AI that's coming in? One of the critiques that I often get, so I'm building the whole reciprocity project, as we talked about before, and the critiques is, well, AI is going to do all of this stuff eventually. Why worry about education?
Right.
What do you see with this in terms of the onslaught of AI? Is there room for good quality education? UCLA or otherwise?
I mean, I think there is, but I think that, we need to think about how AI and the sort of availability of AI is going to change the value of different types of skills, right? I think we still don't know exactly, but to give you, kind of one example of something that I've been, kind of integrated now into my entrepreneurship course. So I used to do this thing where they came up with an idea, they would give me a paragraph, and then I'd give them feedback on, well, these are things you should maybe think about, right, with this idea. Now I've got AI, and basically I say, write that paragraph, but feed it into ChatGPT or Claude or your favorite, LLM, and give it some prompts around, play devil's advocate, what could go wrong with this venture. And then I'd say, well, then take that and ask it for some possible solutions. And so the thing that's interesting about what you get out of the LLM is that it's most of the things that are really big problems are in there, right? But it's a subset, right? Like, so there might be 2 or 3 things that really are issues with the idea the person has, but ChatGPT is going to give them like 10 or 12. And then when it suggests solutions, there's going to be a couple good ideas in there, but it's going to give them 10 or 12. And so the skill, or what I grade them on now, and what I think they need to learn there, is kind of judgment. Like, how do you decide which of the problems that are being identified, which of the solutions that are being proposed are really the ones that are worth focusing on, and why? And that's a little bit different type of skill from kind of brainstorming those in the first place. So I think one of the things that's likely to become more important with AI is particularly verbal communication skills and oral when you're talking with other people. Written communication, AI can do a lot, right, in terms of improving kind of writing, automating writing. But when you're actually interacting with people, kind of one-on-one or in small groups, like, it's much harder to think about AI sitting in an earpiece in your ear and telling you what to say next. And so one of the things I like about kind of breakout in this kind of move in terms of ed tech is that this is giving students a lot of practice in those kind of small group discussions, kind of interacting, the give and take, being able to persuade their classmates of a particular point of view. And I think those are skills that are actually going to be more valuable, as the kind of AI becomes more ubiquitous and, begins to, kind of crowd out other types of skills and tasks.
Yeah, and it's not only about just judgment as well, but it's that implementation, right? It's the repeated judgment, the repeated making decisions over and over and over again that actually tends to be very important. AI does a really not so, I mean, it'll generate an answer, but then you have to actually go out and do that. And it's not just about putting up, a web page, right? There's a lot more to building a business or, establishing something that is.
Right. I mean, managing people, right? I mean, maybe, AI can do a little bit of, certain things for you, but a lot of that is, kind of an interpersonal skill that I think will be very hard to replace.
Yeah, and certainly it does a better job of like replying to emails for sure. It could be a lot more nicer person. or review our letters for sure.
That's right.
So given that we're almost at an hour at this moment of your time, and my audience tends to be on the Reciprocity channel, tends to be a lot of researchers, a lot of people that are thinking of going into research, some people that have made it, quote unquote, made it in terms of, doing research. Is there anything that you would like to tell them based on your lifelong experiences at this moment? And we haven't talked, you've done many different things, and you have a very interesting background. Is there anything that you would like to tell them?
I would come back to, this statement that I made pretty early in our conversation that, research is consumption, right? And why do I think that's important? To kind of reiterate is that I think it's really important to choose topics and research projects that you find intrinsically interesting to you. I feel like too many people try to pick topics based on what they think is trendy now, or kind of what's like being talked about in the journals, and those may or may not actually be interesting to them. And that if you're picking topics that are interesting to somebody else, then that I feel like that's kind of tedious. But if you're picking things that are interesting to you, well, then, doing the research itself is interesting. And, a lot of the things that I've had that have ended up, I think, getting the most attention have been things that actually nobody was really doing research on at the time that I started them. And, they've just sort of come around and become, other people realize that those were, kind of interesting questions. Not everything. Some of the things, just kind of I wrote up and, maybe nobody reads, but that's okay too, right? I enjoyed doing it. So I think I would really kind of reiterate this thing. Think about, research as consumption, like given that, like what is it that you really want to do?
Yeah, and a big thing, I love that. So one of the quotes that I probably have fallen in love with the most with Jim March is he said at one point that he was not relevant and never will be relevant.
Exactly.
and I love that because it gives you freedom, and like you're saying, to be weird, to be unusual. And I think that's it's one of the most important things that we have to do is figure out to what degree we're willing to be weird in culture.
Yeah, and actually, honestly, I think that AI is going to increase the value of being weird. Because if you think about what AI is really good at, right? What it's really good at is taking a bunch of things that we know a lot about and compiling them or integrating them. What it seems to be less good at is, really just, going out into completely new areas and new ways of looking at things, right? It's not surprising, right? These are basically prediction engines, right, for the next word. And so, if it hasn't been able to be trained on something, it's not likely to, generate a prediction of it.
So with that, Olav, I do appreciate the time that you spent here. And if anybody wants to reach out to you, you can find him at UCLA, and he's in he's teaching entrepreneurship there. He's professor of strategy. He's pretty well known. And I'll put a link in the description as well. So thank you so much for your time. I definitely appreciate it. Hopefully the audience appreciates you as well.
Yeah, thank you. You're welcome. I hope you have a great day.
All right, take care.